Hello, thanks for watching this film. My name is Paul Wilkinson. I'm better known as a musician, but being a musician often means being involved in education to survive in this zeitgeist. So I've always been fascinated with the title of this film, What Does It Mean to Be Educated? Probably for over a decade, I've investigated different kinds of schooling, unschooling, homeschooling, all the different kinds of ways that young people flourish and learn. So this video is really... Bertrand Russell, the great philosopher, said, I wouldn't die for one of my ideas because I might be wrong. So before you begin watching this, you've got to put aside what you might think it means to be educated. What's the function of education? Is it to continue the same story? How do we know what young people need to know in the next 5 years? And so it's viewing it from different architectures of thinking. One of the most, what I would call meta moves in human history, the one that is applied by everybody, all the great thinkers, is called the Hegel dialectic. The Hegel dialectic is you have an idea, so they call it the thesis-antithesis moves. There's your thesis, your idea. The opposite is to unpack your idea as though it's bad, and then reform them, so that then you have a much richer dialectic opinion. You've brought in different kind of opinions, and you have a deeper understanding. Because to see something again for the first time is very hard when you're lost in it. If you're born with orange glasses, the snow's always orange. So this film is about that, and I've collected together some of the great thinkers who are interested in education, but from many different perspectives. So first of all, here we have a great thinker who's sadly no longer with us, called Ken Robinson. This is one of his very famous TED Talks.
I have a big interest in education, and I think we all do. We have a huge vested interest in it, partly because it's education that's meant to take us into this future that we can't grasp. If you think of it, children starting school this year will be retiring in 2065. Nobody has a clue, despite all the expertise that's been on parade for the past 4 days, what the world will look like in 5 years' time. And yet we're meant to be educating them for it. So the unpredictability, I think, is extraordinary. And the third part of this is that we've all agreed, nonetheless, on the really extraordinary capacities that children have, their capacities for innovation. I mean, Serena last night was a marvel, wasn't she? Just seeing what she could do. And she's exceptional, but I think she's not, so to speak, exceptional in the whole of childhood. What you have there is a person of extraordinary dedication who found a talent. And my contention is all kids have tremendous talents, and we squander them pretty ruthlessly. So I want to talk about education, and I want to talk about creativity. My contention is that creativity now is as important in education as literacy, and we should treat it with the same status. Thank you. That was it, by the way. Thank you very much. So, 15 minutes left. Well, I was born... No, I had a great story recently, I love telling it, of a little girl who was in a drawing lesson. She was 6, and she was at the back drawing, and the teacher said, this little girl hardly ever paid attention. And in this drawing lesson, she did. And the teacher was fascinated. She went over to her, and she said, what are you drawing? And the girl said, I'm drawing a picture of God. And the teacher said, but nobody knows what God looks like. And the girl said, they will in a minute. When my son was 4 in England, actually he was 4 everywhere, to be honest. I mean, if we're being strict about it, wherever he went, he was 4 that year. But he was in the Nativity play. Do you remember the story? No, it was big. It's a big story. Mel Gibson did the sequel. You may have seen it. I don't know. It was Nativity 2. But James got the part of Joseph, which we were thrilled about. We consider this to be one of the lead parts. We had the place crammed full of agents and T-shirts, you know. James Robinson is Joseph. He didn't have to speak, but do you know the bit where the 3 kings come in? They come in bearing gifts, and they bring gold, frankincense, and myrrh. This really happened. We're sitting there, and they, I think, just went out of sequence. Because we talked to the little boy afterwards and said, you know, are you OK with that? And they said, yeah, why was that wrong? They just switched. I think that was it. Anyway, the 3 boys came in, little 4-year-olds with tea towels on their heads, and they put these boxes down. The first boy said, I bring you gold. And the second boy said, I bring you mare. And the third boy said, Frank sent this. What these things have in common, you see, is that kids will take a chance. If they don't know, they'll have a go. Am I right? They're not frightened of being wrong. Now, I don't mean to say that being wrong is the same thing as being creative. What we do know is, if you're not prepared to be wrong, you'll never come up with anything original. If you're not prepared to be wrong. And by the time they get to be adults, most kids have lost that capacity. They have become frightened of being wrong. And we run our companies this, by the way. We stigmatize mistakes. And we're now running national education systems where mistakes are the worst thing you can make. And the result is that we are educating people out of their creative capacities. Picasso once said this. He said that all children are born artists. The problem is to remain an artist as we grow up. I believe this passionately, that we don't grow into creativity, we grow out of it. Or rather, we get educated out of it. So why is this? I lived in Stratford-on-Avon until about 5 years ago. In fact, we moved from Stratford to Los Angeles. So you can imagine what a seamless transition, this was from LA. Actually, we lived in a place called Snitterfield, just outside Stratford, which is where Shakespeare's father was born. Are you struck by a new thought? I was. You don't think of Shakespeare having a father, do you? Do you? Because you don't think of Shakespeare being a child. Do you? Shakespeare being 7. I never thought of it. I mean, he was 7 at some point. He was in somebody's English class, wasn't he? Do you understand? Really? How annoying would that be? Must try harder. Being sent to bed by his dad to Shakespeare. Go to bed now, to William Shakespeare, and put the pencil down, and stop speaking like that. It's confusing everybody. Anyway, we moved from Stratford to Los Angeles, and I just want to say a word about the transition. Actually, my son didn't want to come. I've got 2 kids. He's 21 now, and my daughter's 16. He didn't want to come to Los Angeles. He loved it, but he had a girlfriend in England. This was the love of his life, Sarah. He'd known her for a month. Mind you, they'd had their 4th anniversary by then, because it's a long time when you're 16. Anyway, he was really upset on the plane. He said, I'll never find another girl like Sarah. And we were rather pleased about that, frankly, because she was the main reason we were leaving the country. But something strikes you when you move to America and when you travel around the world. Every education system on Earth has the same hierarchy of subjects. Everyone, doesn't matter where you go. You think it would be otherwise, but it isn't. At the top are mathematics and languages, then the humanities, and at the bottom are the arts, everywhere on Earth. And in pretty much every system, too, there's a hierarchy within the arts. Art and music are normally given a higher status in schools than drama and dance. There isn't an education system on the planet that teaches dance every day to children the way we teach them mathematics. Why? Why not? I think this is rather important. I think maths is very important, but so is dance. Children dance all the time if they're allowed to. We all do. We all have bodies, don't we? Did I miss a meeting? I mean, I think... Truthfully, what happens is, as children grow up, we start to educate them progressively from the waist up. And then we focus on their heads, and slightly to one side. If you were to visit education as an alien and say, what's it for, public education, I think you'd have to conclude, if you look at the output, who really succeeds by this? Who does everything they should? Who gets all the brownie points? Who are the winners? I think you'd have to conclude the whole purpose of public education throughout the world is to produce university professors. Isn't it? They're the people who come out the top. And I used to be one. So there. But And I like university professors, but, you know, we shouldn't hold them up as the high watermark of all human achievement. They're just a form of life. You know, another form of life. But they're rather curious, and I say this out of affection for them. There's something curious about professors. In my experience, not all of them, but typically, they live in their heads. They live up there, and slightly to one side. They're disembodied, you know, in a kind of literal way. You know, they look upon their body as a form of transport for their heads. You know, it's... Don't they? It's a way of getting their head to meetings. If you want real evidence of out-of-body experiences, by the way, get yourself along to a residential conference for senior academics and pop into the discotheque on the final night. And there you will see it. Grown men and women writhing uncontrollably off the beat. Waiting to it ends so they can go home and write a paper about it. Now, our education system is predicated on the idea of academic ability. And there's a reason. The whole system was invented around the world. There were no public systems of education really before the 19th century. They all came into being to meet the needs of industrialism. So the hierarchy is rooted on two ideas. Number one, that the most useful subjects for work are at the top. So you were probably steered benignly away from things at school when you were a kid, things you liked, on the ground you would never get a job doing that. Is that right? Don't do music, you're not going to be a musician. Don't do art, you won't be an artist. Benign advice, now profoundly mistaken. The whole world is engulfed in a revolution. And the second is academic ability, which has really come to dominate our view of intelligence because the universities designed the system in their image. If you think of it, the whole system of public education around the world is a protracted process of university entrance. And the consequence is that many highly talented, brilliant, creative people think they're not, because the thing they were good at school wasn't valued or was actually stigmatized. And I think we can't afford to go on that way. In the next 30 years, according to UNESCO, more people worldwide will be graduating through education than since the beginning of history. More people. And it's the combination of all the things we've talked about, technology and its transformational effect on work, and demography and the huge explosion in population. Suddenly, degrees aren't worth anything. Isn't that true? When I was a student, if you had a degree, you had a job. If you didn't have a job, it's because you didn't want one. And I didn't want one, frankly, so... but now, kids with degrees are often heading home to carry on playing video games. Because you need an MA, where the previous job required a BA, and now you need a PhD for the other. It's a process of academic inflation, and it indicates the whole structure of education is shifting beneath our feet. We need to radically rethink our view of intelligence. We know three things about intelligence. One, it's diverse. We think about the world in all the ways that we experience it. We think visually, we think in sound, we think kinesthetically, we think in abstract terms, we think in movement. Secondly, intelligence is dynamic. If you look at the interactions of a human brain, as we heard yesterday from a number of presentations, intelligence is wonderfully interactive. The brain isn't divided into compartments. In fact, creativity, which I define as the process of having original ideas that have value, more often than not, comes about through the interaction of different disciplinary ways of seeing things. The brain is intentionally... By the way, there's a shaft of nerves that joins the two halves of the brain called the corpus callosum. It's thicker in women. Following on from Helen yesterday, I think this is probably why women are better at multitasking. Because you are. Aren't you? There's a raft of research, but I know it from my personal life. If my wife is cooking a meal at home, which is not often, thankfully, but, you know, if she's doing... No, she's good at some things. But if she's cooking, you know, she's dealing with people on the phone, she's talking to the kids, she's painting the ceiling, you know, she's doing open-heart surgery over here. If I'm cooking, the door is shut, the kids are out, the phone's on the hook. If she comes in, I get annoyed. I say, Terry, please, I'm trying to fry an egg in here. You know, really. Give me a break. Actually, there was do you know that old philosophical thing? If a tree falls in a forest and nobody hears it, did it happen? Remember that old chestnut? I saw a great T-shirt, really, recently, which said, if a man speaks his mind in a forest and no woman hears him, is he still wrong? And the third thing about intelligence is it's distinct. I'm doing a new book at the moment called Epiphany, which is based on a series of interviews with people about how they discovered their talent. I'm fascinated by how people got to be there. It's really prompted by a conversation I had with a wonderful woman who most people have never heard of. She's called Jillian Lynn. Have you heard of her? Some have. She's a choreographer, and everybody knows her work. She did Cats and Phantom of the Opera. She's wonderful. I used to be on the board of the Royal Ballet in England, as you can see. And anyway, Jillian and I had lunch one day. I said, how'd you get to be a dancer? And she said it was interesting. When she was at school, she was really hopeless. And the school in the 30s wrote to her parents and said, we think Jillian has a learning disorder. She couldn't concentrate. She was fidgeting. I think now they'd say she had ADHD. Wouldn't you? But this was the 1930s, and ADHD hadn't been invented, at this point. So it wasn't an available condition. People weren't aware they could have that. Anyway, she went to see this specialist. So this oak-panelled room, and she was there with her mother, and she was led and sat on this chair at the end, and she sat on her hands for 20 minutes while this man talked to her mother about all the problems Jillian was having at school. And at the end of it, because she was disturbing people, her homework was always late and so on, little kid of 8, in the end, the doctor went and sat next to Jillian and said, Jillian, I've listened to all these things that your mother's told me. I need to speak to her privately. So he said, wait here, we'll be back. We won't be very long. And they went and left her. But as they went out the room, he turned on the radio that was sitting on his desk. And when they got out the room, he said to her mother, just stand and watch her. And the minute they left the room, she said she was on her feet, moving to the music. And they watched for a few minutes, and he turned to her mother, and he said, Mrs. Lynn, Jillian isn't sick. She's a dancer. Take her to a dance school. I said, what happened? He said, she did. I can't tell you how wonderful it was. We walked in this room, and it was full of people like me. People who couldn't sit still. People who had to move to think. Who had to move to think. They did ballet, they did tap, they did jazz, they did modern, they did contemporary. She was eventually auditioned for the Royal Ballet School. She became a soloist. She had a wonderful career at the Royal Ballet. She eventually graduated from the Royal Ballet School, found her own company, the Jillian Lynn Dance Company, met Andrew Lloyd Webber. She's been responsible for some of the most successful musical theatre productions in history. She's given pleasure to millions, and she's a multi-millionaire. Somebody else might have put her on medication and told her to calm down. Now, I think... What I think it comes to is this. Al Gore spoke the other night about ecology and the revolution that was triggered by Rachel Carson. I believe our only hope for the future is to adopt a new conception of human ecology, one in which we start to reconstitute our conception of the richness of human capacity. Our education system has mined our minds in the way that we've strip-mined the earth for a particular commodity, and for the future, it won't serve us. We have to rethink the fundamental principles on which we're educating our children. There was a wonderful quote by Jonas Salk, who said, if all the insects were to disappear from the earth, within 50 years, all life on earth would end. If all human beings disappeared from the earth, within 50 years, all forms of life would flourish. And he's right. What TED celebrates is the gift of the human imagination. We have to be careful now that we use this gift wisely and that we avert some of the scenarios that we've talked about. And the only way we'll do it is by seeing our creative capacities for the richness they are and seeing our children for the hope that they are. And our task is to educate their whole being so they can face this future. By the way, we may not see this future, but they will. And our job is to help them make something of it. Thank you very much.
Bravo. Yeah.
This next film explores a great thinker called John Holt. Now, John Holt wrote some famous books. One of his most famous books is How Children Fail. It should probably be titled How Children Are Failed, and that's a reference really to our education system. He was a great thinker in the 60s and 70s, and he moved away more from school in the end to more to a homeschooling movement. So John Holt's perspective is really interesting. So here's some words from John.
Babies come into the world extraordinarily curious, eager to learn, extraordinarily resourceful and competent at learning, that they are, in the most literal sense of the word, scientists. They do exactly what scientists do. They use the scientific method in making sense of the world around them. And then they get to a certain age, which may be as young as 3, but in any case, the age of school, and this process is turned off by adults who think they are now going to direct and control the learning of these children, who they treat them like empty receptacles into which they are going to pour whatever learning they think they ought to have.
In 1964, John Holt, an Ivy League graduate and a teacher in alternative schools, published his first book, How Children Fail, in which he lays the blame for the failure of school children squarely on the compulsory school system. Not surprisingly, How Children Fail was extremely controversial, and John Holt was soon famous for rattling the American national consciousness. Perhaps no one knows more about John Holt and his work than Pat Ferenga. Here at his office in Boston, Massachusetts, Pat keeps John Holt's legacy alive.
I got involved with John Holt in 1981. We were talking, and then, so he asked me, so what do you want to do with your life? And so I told him, the honest truth, which was I was thinking of being a teacher. And he said, why? I said, because I like working with children. And he took his glasses off and looked at me. He said, Pat, if you become a teacher, you're not going to work with children. You're going to work on children. And I couldn't believe it. What are you saying? And before I could start my argument, she was like, have you read any of my books? I said, no. He said, well, start. So at that time, his book, Teach Your Own, had just come out. So I figured, let me start with that one. I couldn't get into it. By the second chapter, I was pulling my hair out, thinking, this guy's crazy. Who's going to teach her? This is nuts. And so I remember talking to Peg Durkee, his business manager at the time, and she said, well, why don't you start with his first book, How Children Fail? So I read How Children Fail, and it made sense to me. I got it. And then I was able to engage John in all these conversations.
By the mid-70s, Holt had officially given up on reforming schools, and instead turned his attention to a movement he had been previously unaware of: homeschooling.
John hit a nerve. No one knew that all these people were out there. And once you realized that these parents from all around the country were doing it but not in touch with one another, you started Growing Without Schooling magazine. First issue was August 1977.
Growing Without Schooling magazine helped bring together homeschoolers from all over the country.
A substantial number of homeschoolers agree with me, but this is already a sort of a highly selected group within the population. These are people who, to a degree rather rare in society, really appreciate their children, like their daily company, pay a kind of sustained and serious attention to what they do, find fascinating, as I do, their growth, their learning, the ways in which these little people explore the world. If you like that, it's the most interesting and marvelous thing in the world, and these people do. So it's not hard for them, or at least a lot of them, to hear what I am saying about children as autonomous and self-motivated learners. And even those who may begin skeptical will soon see in the lives of their children evidence to support that. So they're ready to move in that direction. But in the general public, no. The general public, like the majority of schools, is deeply committed against freedom, deeply committed to the idea that children won't do anything good unless somebody makes them.
The next perspective we're going to take is by Ivan Illich. Ivan Illich wrote a number of books, and we're going to focus on his one called Deschooling Society. So included is a little bit here of the opening of the book, which is a very, very rich book. And followed after that is an interview with the great futurist and philosopher and educationalist Zack Stein. Zack Stein has written a fabulous book called Education in a Time Between Worlds, where he unpacks ADHD, the profits that are made from stats. It's a very rich book. If you're a teacher, it's a fascinating book to read. Zack Stein is a very erudite thinker, and I find his thinking very rich and very informative. So here's a little bit about Ivan Illich, and then we'll move on to Zack Stein talking a little bit about how Ivan Illich influenced his writing regarding schooling. And Zack Stein has explored all these different kind of schoolings as I have myself. So there's lots of different schools. I don't think people realise. The Sudbury Valley schools, which are democratic schools. That's where the teachers and the children have a one vote each. So if if the kids don't like the teachers are voted in or out every year. Of course, they're not voted out, of course, because there is a love there from the teachers that's very deeply felt with the students. So it's a two-way. It's a simpatico. It's a two-way relationship. There's things like the Steiner schools. Of course, often the Steiner schools, the teacher will stay with the child throughout their schooling. And of course, they love the child and the children love them because they know them better than ever. They're not changed from one class to another. The teacher is with them all the time. There's other kind of schoolings like tinkering schooling, where it's like a big open warehouse where everybody's doing everything together. There's flip schooling, where you do your homework at school and your schoolwork at home via some videos and things. So there's lots of different ways of schooling. Here's Zack Stein talk a little bit about the power of and the influence of the work of Ivan Illich.
Many students, especially those who are poor, intuitively know what the schools do for them. They school them to confuse process and substance. Once these become blurred, a new logic is assumed. The more treatment there is, the better are the results, or escalation leads to success. The pupil is thereby schooled to confuse teaching with learning, grade advancement with education, a diploma with competence, and fluency with the ability to say something new. His imagination is schooled to accept service in place of value. Medical treatment is mistaken for health care, social work for the improvement of community life, police protection for safety, military poise for national security, the rat race for productive work. Health, learning, dignity, independence, and creative endeavour are defined as little more than the performance of those institutions which claim to serve these ends, and their improvement is made to depend on allocating more resources to the management of hospitals, schools, and other agencies in question. In these essays, I will show that the institutionalization of values leads inevitably to physical pollution, social polarization, and psychological impotence, 3 dimensions in a process of global degradation and modernized misery. I will examine how this process of degradation is accelerated when non-material needs are transformed into demands for commodities, when health, education, personal mobility, welfare, or psychological healing are defined as the results of services or treatments. I do this because I believe that most of the research now going on about the future tends to advocate further increases in the institutionalization of values, and that we must define conditions which would permit precisely the contrary to happen. We need research on the possible use of technology to create institutions which serve personal, creative, and autonomous interaction, and the emergence of values which cannot be substantially controlled by technocrats. We need counterfoil research to current futurology. I want to raise the general question of the mutual definition of man's nature and the nature of modern institutions, which characterizes our worldview and language. To do so, I have chosen the school as my paradigm. I therefore deal only indirectly with other bureaucratic agencies of the corporate state, the consumer family, the party, the army, the church, the media. My analysis of the hidden curriculum of school should make it evident that public education would profit from the deschooling of society, just as family life, politics, security, faith, and communication would profit from an analogous process.
Can you talk about Ivan Illich and
Sure.
Deschooling society?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the main threads throughout my new book, which you mentioned, The Education in a Time Between Worlds is the title. And basically Illich blew it away. He blew it away. Like, and you read him now and you're like, how can it still be the way it is, given that Ivan Illich wrote this?
Yeah.
That one, namely Deschooling Society and Medical Nemesis.
Yeah, that one also, yeah. Right.
He gets into the multi-level iatrogenic crises that plague modern industrial societies. But Deschooling Society is a remarkable book, and even more remarkable because it was written before the internet. Like, many of the ideas that are within it are...
Well, I would like to say that he's a prophet of some kind. Like, I put him in the category of prophet, not just thinker.
Yeah.
You know.
Totally. Well, I mean, he was a Catholic priest, so that sense of the prophetic, and then the actual prophetic voice, that he had a prophetic voice. When you hear him speak, he has the word sound power, as the Rastas say. But there's also a way in which, because he had a religiosity, it allowed his social critique to be even deeper, that he was actually looking at evil, and not as a secularist explaining it away with evolutionary theory because we evolved to be meat machines that compete and kill. But Illich, thinking that man has an eternal soul and is yet doing this to himself, sick, him namely. And so Illich was seeing very clearly and was pulling no punches. And he saw what many people have seen with the nature of large modern school systems, which is that they are, at their worst, profoundly dehumanizing. And the apparatus of state control, social control, and ideological indoctrination. I mean, there's a bunch of things you can do with the school system that you couldn't do if you had a decentralized, community-based system of education where the parents basically took control of their kids, which is what it had been for a very long time. And what we know of as schools are political entities, which began with the birth of the capitalist world.
This kind of leads nicely on to the next person I want to talk about, the philosopher Baudrillard. So they're quite intrinsically linked. If you've seen The Matrix, you'll be familiar with Baudrillard's work. Really inspired the film, as we'll just see in a moment. So if you think about, this is game A that we play at the moment. This is the imaginary we have, that we live on this planet. We could live another way on this planet, but we live this way, where capitalism, materialism, matter, the acquisition of more things, working at the sort of prominence from the Industrial Revolution, and we're still working through that. That's the story of our zeitgeist at the moment. So Baudrillard kind of questioned this in his very short but very well-packed book, a great philosopher and great thinker. Here's some thoughts from Baudrillard.
Are we all living in a simulation? If you were to ask the French philosopher Jean Baudrillard this question, his answer would be a definitive yes. Although what he means by simulation and what you mean by simulation might be two very different things. Which is funny, considering the most influential example of a simulation was directly inspired by Baudrillard's 1981 work, Simulation and Simulacra. This is the book that we see Neo hiding the computer disks he sells in the first Matrix in, and it's the one book that the Wachowski siblings made required reading for everyone on the crew of the Matrix movies. But despite this famous example of the mainstream idea of the simulation being directly inspired by Baudrillard's work, what the French postmodern philosopher means by the term simulation is something much more insidious and much scarier than what we find in the Matrix movies. This Baudrillardian idea of simulation is, to my mind, one of the most hauntingly prescient philosophical ideas you'll ever come across. More relevant and scary than either 1984 or Brave New World. Simulation and Simulacra is the dystopia of our present, a dystopia that is so all-encompassing and yet impossibly hard to grasp that we have walked blindly into it. It's the most accurate diagnosis of the slope we find ourselves free-falling down with our culture's departure from modernity into the unreal simulation that is the postmodern.
The next thinker I want to bring into this film is John Taylor Gatto, a teacher for many years, and he wrote a number of books, Dumbing Us Down, The Weapons of Mass Instruction, where he basically unpacks being a teacher from the inside. He reveals all the secrets that many of us teachers know, and he wrote about it in these two books. So here's a little bit from John Taylor Gatto.
Schooling is a form of adoption. You give your kid away at his most, or his or her most plastic years, to a group of strangers. You accept a promise, sometimes stated and more often implied, that the state, through its agents, knows better how to raise your children and educate them than you, your neighbors, your grandparents, your local traditions do. And that your kid will be better off so adopted. By the time the child returns to the family or has the option of doing that, very few want to. Their parents are some form of friendly stranger too, and why not? In the key hours of growing up, strangers have reared the kid. Now let's look at the strangers, of which you were one and I was one. Regardless of our good feeling toward children, regardless of our individual talents or intelligence, we have so little time each day with each of these kids, we can't possibly know enough vital information about that particular kid to tailor a set of exercises to that kid. Oh, some of us, will try more than others, but there simply isn't any time to do it to a significant degree. So what we do is accept, and of course if we don't accept this, we're fired or harassed. We accept a state's prescription that's written in manuals. You do this first and this second and this third, and here you have a little latitude to talk to the kids. And the way the state checks on whether you've followed that diet is there's standardized tests given at intervals. If your kids do badly, it does not mean that they're bad readers or anything else. It means that they haven't been obedient to the drills the state set down, and they're marked for further treatment later on, or they're marked to be excluded from responsible jobs. Perhaps some ways by being excluded from the colleges that lead to responsible jobs, in other ways from the licenses that lead to responsible jobs. This was all worked out. It didn't evolve by a lot of rational people saying, we'll take this, this, and this from the past, then the next generation will take this, this, and this. This was set down largely in a handful of places. Prussia was perhaps the most prominent of those places. And the Prussian experiment leaped into the United States almost immediately in the 1840s, leaped into the United States. Its propagandists covered the country here. Its backers, its financial backers, set up the most important teacher training institutes and financed those institutes. And then no one was allowed to become a teacher who didn't more or less subscribe to the fact that experts could create a curriculum and pedagogues could administer it. Well, that's exactly what Horace, the Roman essayist, talked about in several of his essays. He said, the master creates the lessons. The pedagogue, the teacher, administers the lessons. But if you find the teacher creating the lessons or deviating from the direction those lessons are headed in, you get rid of the pedagogue. But the people who gave us schooling weren't these wealthy people. They were utopian thinkers who believed the family and tradition were the greatest obstacles to making a perfect society, a utopia. And every utopia that survived invents schooling long before we had universal force schooling. There were always little neighborhood schools, but they all invent universal schooling of a homogeneous variety in order to reach utopia. Now let's shift to the basis of your question, which is Rockefeller and Carnegie and J.P. Morgan. These people saw a different kind of utopia through solving the problem of production with high-speed machinery. They saw that material abundance could be created, and that first of all, of course, they thought they could become supremely wealthy, which they did. But secondarily, they weren't beasts. They thought that this material abundance, since they had abandoned a belief in a creator or an afterlife, this material abundance was the best that a human life could aim for. And to do that, the family had to be moved off center stage, and the children had to be processed like raw materials. These are the people who saw to it with their influence that when legislation that was wildly radical based on any past model was proposed, that the right legislators would vote that legislation through. They saw to it that money was available to build these vast piles of brick and stone and to drain children out of the community by the force of law, mind you. If you gave children and families options, it probably would take half a decade before many people tried the options. But I think inside of a decade, the institutional schools would vanish because they don't teach the way children learn, nor can they teach the way children learn. That's not what they're set up to do. They're set up to produce a predictable, homogeneous, safe product. They're set up to sort people into occupational categories, roughly consonant with what the current economy demands.
Okay, what's going to follow now is a few clips from a film called Schooling the World. It's a beautiful, beautiful film, and it's on the internet. It's on YouTube, I reckon. You can also go to the Schooling the World website, directed by Carol Black. It shows what happens when Western education is pushed upon different kind of cultures and societies, and it sees what happens when we try and push our story upon their story. Their way of living is not as important as our way of living, and you see that these young people come back, having been in the cities, and then come back to their villages, and they're unable to function in the environments they grow up in. So it's a beautiful film, and it's very enlightening. So here's a few clips from Schooling the World.
There's no doubt that if we look honestly at the traditional forms of education and compare them to today's modern education system, that the traditional forms of knowledge fostered sustainability. All these cultures were not perfect, but they did know about their own specific climate, soil, water, and they did manage to survive independently, in charge of their own lives, for generation after generation. In the modern economy and with the modern educational system, the children learn nothing about that, but instead they learn how to use essentially corporate products in an urban consumer culture. So once they've been educated in modern schools, they literally don't know how to survive in their own environment.
I think the way Western education has grown over the last few centuries, especially with the rise of industrialization, was basically not to create human beings fully equipped to deal with life and all its problems, independent citizens, able to exercise their decisions and live their responsibilities in community, but elements to feed into an industrial production system. They were products with partial knowledge. We moved from wisdom to knowledge, and now we are moving from knowledge to information, and that information is so partial that we are creating incomplete human beings.
If we look back at the beginning of so-called education, the agenda was very clear. There was an elite that wanted to train people to serve their needs, to essentially create an extractive economy that served the few at the expense of the many. So there's very explicit literature. Very clearly, education was there to train a class of people to serve the needs of the elite.
Peter Gray is a child development psychologist, and his son was very unhappy at school, and he ended up taking his son out of school, and by doing that his son grew and flourished. He listened to his son, but most importantly than that, he then inspired him to explore all these different kinds of schools that would benefit his son. But when we say school, you've got to put aside what, like I said earlier, you've got to put aside what you think a school actually is. A school doesn't, we don't always learn sat behind a desk. In fact, it might be suggested we don't learn at all. Some of us need to move around and run around, some of us need to get up, some of us need to be on the move. So we explored that in a beautiful book called Free to Learn, and I recommend that to anybody interested in this kind of more holistic, more based around what the human is capable of. We as humans implant an epistemology, that is, we implant a way of being, a way of living on the planet, because apparently we know best. But it could be suggested that these young, when we're born, we know everything, but we get schooled into not knowing it. I believe the human's capable of far more than we give it credit for if we could just let go of our school system. So Peter Gray explores this beautifully, and here's a few clips of that.
I'm Peter Gray. I'm a research professor in psychology at Boston College. I'm an evolutionary psychologist, which means that I'm interested in human nature and how that nature came about by natural selection. I'm especially interested in the nature of human children, and most especially in those aspects of children's nature that came about by natural selection to serve their education.
First condition is a clear understanding that education is the child's responsibility. When children know that they're responsible for their education, they take that responsibility. When they believe, they're led to believe that somebody else is responsible for their education and all they have to do is do what they're told, then they tend to do that in the minimal way and they don't take responsibility for their education. Second condition, unlimited opportunity to play, explore, and pursue your own interests. Unlimited time, not an hour a day, not 2 hours a day, unlimited time. It takes time to try out different things. It takes time to get bored, to overcome boredom. You can't interrupt that with bells and telling people constantly what to do and expect people to really develop a passion. 3, opportunity to play with the tools of the culture, to really play with the tools of the culture. In a hunter-gatherer culture, those would be bows and arrows and knives and fire and digging sticks. In our culture, of course, the main tool is a computer. And it's not surprising that children everywhere in our culture love to play with computers. They know in their bones that this is the tool of the culture, and they need to spend a lot of time with it. So it becomes, in a sense, an extension of their own body. Access to a variety of caring adults who are helpers, not judges. How important that last part is. Helpers, not judges. The last person you want to go to help you learn something is somebody who's evaluating you. You're nervous about that person. That person is a person you go to in the frame of mind of trying to impress that person with how much you know, not to say, I really don't know this and I would like some help. Free age mixing among children and adolescents are absolutely key to the school. The school would not work if it were children all the same age, because children don't have much to learn from others who are the same age. They learn from children who are older and from children who are younger than themselves. 6, immersion in a stable, moral, democratic community. Communities in which every child knows that their ideas and their actions influence the others involved in the community. So they're growing up in a setting where they feel responsible not just for themselves, but for the community within which they are developing.
Finally, I just want to talk a little bit about one of the key important things that's very hard to grasp if you've maybe lost sight of it. We don't know what we see what we know. Or we could say knowledge of the world is a kind of ignorance. We have a dominant way of teaching of the age, a dominant metaphysics. And this basically presupposes, so stick with me a minute here, this presupposes that we invent something outside of us, which we call matter. And then we say that our minds, which are alive with consciousness, we say that consciousness comes out of matter. Now we've got to be very careful with this, because already we're wrong. We don't know what we see what we know. If I were to send you up to the top of a mountain and wipe your mind clean of any of our knowledge of language, what would you describe what you saw? This is what the great poets like William Blake, Wordsworth, Taylor Coleridge and the others, and even going back to the Sufi Islamic tradition, the mystic tradition of Rumi, for example, try and unpack, is that we make language up. Language is our greatest invention, but it's already dashboard knowledge. It's just like graph paper trying to put over to name something. So when you look at something like a tree, you're already running the dead concept tree. So this is a very hard thing to explain when we've lost sight of it, because all our presuppositions are built on the fact that language is primary and language is right. Now, it's absolutely cannot be the case. It's a partial truth at best. And so I'm now going to finish with Bernardo Kastrup, the philosopher, in a conversation with a great teacher called Rupert Spira, and they might help us a little bit unpack this story. And I'll leave you with this. This is one of the deep things that is starting to unpack itself in the time we're at now, that people are starting to realise the limitations of the language, because it's an inner experience. Owen Barfield, the great philosopher, said,
well, I don't think that the mind is something that goes on in the brain. I think the brain was originally formed by the mind, or by mind, not any particular person's mind, and then use the brain to produce the subjective picture of the world in which we live.
I believe they are formed by other minds, and this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with other minds' perspectives of reality, but they're not truthful because they come from somebody else's mind and they're not from our experience initially. It's a deep topic, but I hope to just finish with this. I've left it till the end because it's probably one of the most hardest things to grasp at first. So don't forget, we don't know what we see what we know. And now we finish with Bernardo Kastrup in a conversation. And finally, Rupert Spira is there as well. And Rupert finishes that, explaining a little bit more about this presupposition of matter consciousness, where actually we might be able to suggest it the other way around, that it's consciousness, and then we invent words outside of consciousness to name things. A nice analogy is when you were born, your parents might have had a different name for you, and they stuck on that name, and that's the name you've been called ever since. But it could be wrong, and it's certainly incomplete.
My materialism does not tick the enlightenment box.
Oh, explanatory power. It doesn't explain experience, which is all we have. So there is a sense in which it explains nothing. Internal consistency. It defines matter by definition. It defines matter as that which has nothing to do with qualities. And then it tries to explain qualities in terms of matter. It's an internal inconsistency. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but you asked for one, I gave you two.
And you did give it to you too. And the fact that you laughed, I think, speaks. I mean, you do find it laughable once you've looked at it, it seems to me.
Yeah. Materialism is the worst option on the table right now. It is It is literally laughable.
Okay.
And the reason we don't laugh about it in the culture is that culture has manufactured plausibility for it.
Okay.
What the materialist does is presume a substance outside consciousness called matter, which nobody has ever found. Scientists have been looking for it for 2,500 years. They haven't found it. They won't ever find it. They abstract or imagine this substance called matter outside consciousness. They then consider that substance, matter, to be the fundamental reality. And then they imagine in a convoluted line of reasoning that they then imagine that consciousness is derived from matter. They believe that the only thing that is ever truly known is derived from something that is never known. It's madness.
If we aspire to go beyond our present state of consciousness, if we truly want to be happier, to love and know ourselves better, to regain meaning and wholeness, the old disciplines only serve to deepen the illusion of manifest reality. We must look beyond the veil of form to a realization of oneness, present in you, in me, the universe, and everything. When you grasp this, it will put you on the threshold of what is real and your place in reality. Reality is wholeness, undivided wholeness, and this fact has yet to dawn on billions of people.